Well, firstly, I'd like to thank everybody for inviting me here today. It's a real pleasure. The last time I was in the Aviva Stadium, there was many more people than just this crowd here, and we won, so it's okay. I was already interested in some of the papers today, and I think it was, and I don't know whether it was Ant or Dex, so forgive me. But one of this year, just I suppose, just as an anecdote, I turned up to my daughter's school for the annual Parent-Teacher Day, and the principal opened it by saying, "I want you all to know I have depression and I have anxiety." And the principal started the talk with that. So it is beginning to happen, albeit probably not so often. And the students are now working on disability issues as a result in the school. So the change is beginning to happen. And when it came from the principal, I think it made it okay for others to talk about that issue. So that's totally away from my paper. I've been asked to talk about the topic of disclosing and accommodation, on understanding the legalities. Now, what I plan to do is discuss the duty to provide reasonable accommodation. And as part of that discussion, the question of whether it's necessary to disclose or not will be addressed. And I'm also going to make a distinction between disclosing a disability and a dialogue around a disability, because they're two very separate issues, and both are important in the context of reasonable accommodation. I'm going to start by saying reasonable accommodation is a much misunderstood concept. And there's confusion about the nature of the legal duty. It's confused with other legal duties like affirmative action or accessibility. There's confusion about who's entitled to a reasonable accommodation, what accommodations are, who the duty bearers are, what the actual duty is, the parameter of that duty. And that confusion is evident in many spheres. It's evident that employers don't get it. It's quite evident that educators don't get it. It's quite evident the Department of Education on occasion doesn't get it. It's quite clear as well that on occasion the courts don't get it. But to be clear, the concept is much misunderstood, but it's not hard, and it's not complex, and it isn't that difficult. And I hope today to show you that and to actually get that understanding of it. More fundamentally, I think that what's really important to note is that those misunderstandings are absolutely no indication of how important the central importance of the concept of reasonable accommodation is for the equality agenda for people with disabilities. This concept is going to come more to the fore rather than kind of disappear to the background. This is something we're going to have to get to terms with, we're going to have to get to grips with, because it is only going to grow with importance, and that is quite clear because of the European Union obligations, because of our international human rights obligations, as well as our national legal obligations. So it is important that people with disabilities understand the duty to provide reasonable accommodation. And very simply, I could go into lots of terms from the legislation, so I'm not going to. You'll be glad to know. I am going to just very briefly introduce where it comes from in the Irish legal sense, and then very kind of simply break it down into two parts, because that's all it is. There's two elements to the duty. It's fairly straightforward. It just requires a bit of thinking. Employers don't often want to. Obviously, I'm not talking about ESB, but some employers don't want to. And people don't like change, and they don't like difference, and they find that kind of threatening on occasion. So the duty to provide reasonable accommodation, as I said, it's a legal duty. For what we're going to talk about today, we're going to look at the one in the Employment Equality Act very briefly. It's also covered in the Equal Status Act. Also of note is that it is also covered by the Framework Employment Directive by the European Union, and it is everywhere within the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It is imbued throughout the entire convention, and Ireland is the only EU member state not to have ratified the convention. We are one of 15 countries in the world not to have ratified. There are 193 countries that could have ratified. We're one of 15 not to have ratified. Regardless of whether we've ratified or not, the EU has, in its own right. It's the first time the European Union has ratified an international human rights treaty, so it's coming at us indirectly. We will ratify it because the EU will ultimately require it, but so it's there. And once we do, then the duty to provide reasonable accommodation will be required, not just in the context of the Equal Status Act and the Employment Equality Act. It'll be required in criminal justice systems, it'll be required in healthcare, it'll be required in housing, it'll be required throughout our life activities. So it's important to understand the concept. I'm happy to answer questions about any element of these at a later point. Okay. So I've broken down reasonable accommodation into just two parts. There's just two things to know. The duty to accommodate to a particular individual. I'm quite conscious that going through legislation can be fairly tedious work. It's even more tedious if I start to stand here and talk you through legislation, so I don't plan to do that. I plan to just break it down into these two constituent parts. The first part being there is a duty to provide an appropriate measure where it is needed in a particular case to a particular individual, a person with a disability, and in the context of the Irish employment sphere, it is to allow them to have access to employment, to participate in employment, or to advance in employment. And that duty imposes positive legal duties on employers to identify the barriers in the way of a person with a disability and to allow them access employment. So this is the first part of it, and I will go into this in a bit more detail. It is about responding to the person in front of you. And this is where, for example, the Department of Education arguably makes mistakes when it talks about reasonable accommodation. For example, if you think of it in terms of the Leaving Cert, they have these policies saying blind students get this, dyslexic students get that, other students get the other. That's not actually reasonable accommodation at all. It's an accessibility measure. A reasonable accommodation looks at the individual in front of you, works out what that barrier to participation is and addresses that barrier. So it's an individual response. The second part of it then is we look at the impact of such an accommodation on the duty, what I call the duty bearer, in this context the employer. So the person who has the duty to provide the accommodation, what is the impact on them? There may be occasions where the impact or in the Irish context we have said that it provides that any required accommodation shouldn't impose a disproportionate burden, is the phrase they use, on the employer. So again, a number of factors come into consideration, and we assess when an employer, when does an accommodation give rise to a burden that is disproportionate? If you could argue that there is a disproportionate burden on an employer, then they're no longer bound by the duty to provide reasonable accommodation. That's it, they can walk away from it because they don't, it's considered too much. So it's looking at that assessment, it's a second individualised assessment. What is required of an employer in a given situation? Are they able to withstand the provision of this accommodation? And we must look at issues like, is there public funding available? Are there grants available? Are there services available that would help the employer in a given situation? So I'm going to go, as I said, there is undoubtedly confusion around this, so I'm going to go through it in a bit more detail, each of these parts. If the analysis, as I said, if the confusion is broad and it's widespread, I mean, it's throughout, we're seeing it in a number of contexts. So I'm going to go through the first part in a little bit more detail. The term I use in response to what is reasonable accommodation, it's an individualised reactive duty. So it means that, and here I am going to quote from the legislation, actually having said I wouldn't, so I am not to be trusted. So section 16.3b of this Act says, and it's just one sentence, it says an employer shall take appropriate measures where needed in a particular case to enable a person with a disability to have access to and participate in and advance in employment. There are 3 points of note in relation to that one sentence. The first is that it says the employer shall. This is a mandatory obligation. This isn't charity. This isn't something that they can choose to do. This isn't optional for the employer. This is a legal requirement. It is mandatory. The employer must look at this issue. The other element of this is that it talks about appropriate measures. So the measures must be ones that address the actual barrier to participation. You can't, and we've seen situations where people say, oh, I know that person's got a visual impairment, so therefore we'll give them Braille. Not all people read Braille, so therefore that's not necessarily appropriate. You must find out, well, what's the appropriate actual accommodation in this context? And the third element of it is, and this is the crucial element of it, in a particular case. That means it's looking at that individual situation. And this means it's specific to that individual person, and it is the assessment, and we have that assessment for the duty bearer later, but this is an individualised duty. There is no one-size-fits-all approach, which is what the Department of Education has a tendency to do around the exams. There's no one-size-fits-all formula for reasonable accommodations, and different people with the exact same impairments may require different accommodations. You can have, and I do have, so I'm going to give that example, 2 students with visual impairments in one class, and the class has only got 10 students in it. So the 2 students require totally different accommodations. The barrier to participation is that they can't access the material in the way I provide it normally for most students. So one student requires the material in large font, the other student wants to access it through ICT. So and the large font would not actually help the student who has ICT requirements, and equally the ICT requirements wouldn't help the student who needs large font requirements. So we have to figure out, well, what's the barrier? It may be the same barrier, but what's the measure that actually overcomes that barrier may be different. So it's important that it is this individual response, and this, I think, is where the courts get uncomfortable. They like formulas. They like systems. They like to know how things work. And this necessity to assess things on a case-by-case basis makes them uncomfortable, I think is the word I'll use for now. I may go further in a while. People with disabilities do not form a homogenous group. Therefore, any adjustment, any accommodation will depend entirely on that individual and their individual needs. Impairments vary. They vary greatly, as we've heard today. They can be physical, they can be sensory, they can be mental impairments, they can be significant or they can be minor, they can be permanent, they can be intermittent. And additionally, the need for accommodations may vary depending on what context they're sought in. Some students may need accommodations in exams, others may need them in classes, others may need them, I think somebody mentioned earlier today, I think it was Emma said, or was it, I think it was you said, that first year students is one area and then again in fourth year. So it's not all the time, that it changes, and as your requirements change, so the first big change coming into college, another big change kind of at the final year as you leave. So your accommodations will vary. It's not a static test. This student was assessed in first year. This was their accommodation needs in first year. So therefore, this is their accommodation needs for the rest of the time. It's the same in employment. It isn't a static test. It will vary, and it's about that kind of, I suppose, being willing to have that ongoing conversation. It is sensitive. It is this kind of very sensitive and particularised nature of the duty that makes it work. It is the very nuance within the duty that allows it to work in a particular circumstance. What's important is that any accommodation that is provided must address the actual barrier to participation. So you need to figure out what that barrier is. What is stopping that student participation? What is stopping that employee participation? And how do we address that particular barrier? And it is about getting the appropriate measures in the particular case. So this brings me to the first part of, I suppose, the whole question, to disclose or not to disclose. It is necessary, if you're going to get an appropriate accommodation, then dialogue is vital. And I'm distinguishing here between dialogue and disclosure for the moment. Dialogue is necessary for the employer to provide the appropriate accommodation, which can include adapting premises. This is according to the legislation. It can adapt equipment. They can adapt patterns of working time. They can adapt the distribution of tasks. They can provide training. There's a whole range of things that can be actually accommodations. But the significant duty, it must go is, how does an employer guess that? They can't. There's no way for an employer to actually intuit what accommodation a person needs. So therefore, to actually allow for an accommodation, there must be dialogue. There absolutely must be discussion with the employer. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the CRPD Committee, everybody has agreed on this, that the whole discussion around what is and when do reasonable accommodations arise, what are the accommodations, require this conversation to happen between the two parties. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights say that the duty is triggered or it's enforceable from the moment the person asks for an accommodation. That's how you trigger the duty to provide reasonable accommodation. It is the request for the accommodation that triggers that duty. The employer is not required to guess. That's a different legal duty. So it is the triggering, is the asking for the accommodation. And just to be clear on it, the Irish courts, the Office of the High Court of Human Rights, the Courts of Justice of the European Union, the CRPD Committee, the European Court of Human Rights have all stated dialogue is a necessary element of the duty to provide accommodation. In the Irish context, it's a case, a health and fitness club versus a worker. They stated that it was a two-stage process, the duty to provide accommodation, but they said it would only be regarded as adequate if the employee concerned is allowed a full opportunity to participate at every level. So that's that dialogue that has to happen. So what that means in practice under the first part, the duty to accommodate, is there must be a process of dialogue, and it must be, I suppose, stated at the outset. That process can be very brief or it can be very long and detailed. It depends on the nature of the relationship, arguably. Assume you're turning up to you're turning up for an interview. So you're turning up for a job interview and you need an accessible venue. It may just be an email to the employer saying, I need an accessible venue. That's the dialogue over, sorted. If it's a long, ongoing relationship, it may require a more intensive conversation that may be more formal and more structured. And employment relationships generally are. So it may require that the dialogue would be, as I said, ongoing, consultative, and ideally it would not be contentious. It would be entirely uncontentious, and ideally it would be facilitative of both parties. But to be clear, if a person requires a reasonable accommodation, then it is absolutely necessary to disclose your disability. If, however, you do not require a reasonable accommodation, then you do not need to disclose your disability. But if you require it and you want a reasonable accommodation in a particular context, you must A, disclose your disability, and then your employer must enter a process of dialogue with you. That's slightly different to the disclosure. It's a more ongoing discussion. So I'm going to bring us very quickly then to the second part of this duty, and I'm going to be brief because I'm seeing my time is coming up. This isn't an unbounded obligation, and again there is some perception, and I've seen this as well in my own context, where people believe that a reasonable accommodation means anything that they require should be provided in a given situation. It isn't an unbounded obligation. There are limits to the duty. It is limited by the term a disproportionate burden. And I just put this in because I forgot to put that in. It's limited by this term on disproportionate burden. And again, this is a reactive and individualised response. You must look at the duty bearer. So if it's an employer or an educator, well, what are their ability to actually provide that accommodation? We heard it earlier talk about universities where we have the funds, where there is the money, where large public sector universities, the funds are there to provide accommodations. That might not be the case in a small employer who's just getting off the ground with 2 employees. So the very same accommodation, the identical accommodations for 2 people may actually give rise to, in one context saying, yes, that gives rise to a disproportionate burden, and in another context saying, no, it doesn't give rise to a disproportionate burden. That small business with 2 employees may not be able to provide accommodations, whereas a public sector university should be able to. So we look to the individual employer in that given situation. Therefore, determining whether an accommodation gives rise to a disproportionate burden also requires an assessment of their ability to withstand it on a case-by-case basis. And to decide what gives rise to a disproportionate burden, you look to the financial costs, primarily in the Irish context. That it isn't quite as black and white under other provisions. There's other requirements that can be looked at, but in the Irish legislation, we've brought it down to finances. What is the cost, and what is the impact on the employer in a particular situation? Specifically, the legislation requires that such an assessment should look at what public funding is also available. And this is, I think, quite an interesting addition to the legislation. A lot of employers will say, well, that costs too much, so therefore we don't have to provide it. It's not as black and white in that. But the reality is that if there are funds available, if there's a grant available, if there are facilities available offered by the state, and there are lots of grants available and offered by the state in relation to this, accessibility grants in a whole range of areas, then the employer should then assess the cost after taking that grant out of the cost factor, if you know what I mean. So it's the cost that is actual cost to the employer, to having assessed where the grant is. But what that actually also means is that the employer must actually find out what's out there. They have to do it. They have to actually see, are there grants available? Are there supports available? So that gets them thinking in a different way immediately, because they start to think about how can we actually make the accommodation. Okay, I'm going to conclude by stating that there is a perception or a fear that reasonable accommodation gives rise to significant cost burdens on employers. And that fear is evident in a Supreme Court decision, an Irish Supreme Court decision, in relation to the predecessor to the Employment Equality Act. And I just want to bring out, they assumed that all accommodations were costly. So I just want to very briefly, and I'm conscious of time, set out what the Job Accommodation Network, it's an American organisation where they assessed the cost of accommodations under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and they surveyed 1,400 employers, and 59% said that the accommodations required by the employees cost nothing. 36% experienced a one-time cost, 4% noted an ongoing annual cost, with just 1% requiring a combination of a one-time and annual cost, and the typical cost was less than $500. So accommodations are not costly. There is a perception being sold that they're costly. A lot of the time it's just about thinking about how you actually organise your work. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights have reaffirmed it, that all accommodations either have a low cost or none at all. So the cost issue isn't as, I suppose, prohibitive as the suggestion clearly by the Irish Supreme Court. They were completely wrong on that factor. And there is quite a lot of criticism for that because they quite clearly didn't understand the duty. So cost isn't necessarily a factor. I'm going to leave you with this slide because I think this explains what reasonable accommodation is more than I could do in any given situation. And I just would like to explain why I think it does. And just for anybody who can't necessarily see what has been said, it says for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And that's, I kind of think, explains reasonable accommodation in a given situation. We have an education system and an employment system that's quite rigid and quite, definitive in its responses, and we insist on certain kind of hurdles being overcome. And those hurdles are not the same for everybody. And all we're looking at in that context is actually to appreciate our audience and appreciate that we may require different things at different times. And you can clearly see that if I was going to be in that situation, I want to be the bird or the monkey. But, I could just as easily be the goldfish. So how is the goldfish going to climb the tree? It's about thinking about things slightly differently. It isn't that the courts have at times tried to make things overly complex that are not complex. The legal duty is there. Employers are obliged to provide it, but it does require disclosure and it does also require a process of dialogue. And so that's it for me. And thank you very much.